The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its passengers settling into the familiar rhythm of a red-eye flight from Seattle to Denver. Most had their eyes closed, laptops shut, phones dimmed. In row 15, seat C, a woman with calloused hands and a faded scar along her left temple slept deeply, her military-issued duffel bag tucked beneath the seat in front of her. The overhead reading light caught the worn fabric of her jacket, civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide the posture of someone who'd spent years in uniform. Captain Rodriguez felt it first, a subtle change in the aircraft's handling characteristics, like trying to steer through thick honey. The autopilot disengaged with a gentle chime that sent ice through his veins. Denver Control, American 1847, we're experiencing some flight control issues, he transmitted, his voice steady despite the growing tremor in his hands. First Officer Martinez glanced at the instrument panel, watching warning lights cascade across the display like fallen dominoes. "Sir, we're losing hydraulic pressure in System 1. Now System 2. Her voice carried the controlled panic of someone trained to remain calm while the world dissolved around them. The aircraft banked left without input, a lazy drift that belied the catastrophic failure occurring in the belly of the machine. Passengers began to stir as their inner ears detected the anomaly, that subtle wrongness that humans sense when gravity shifts unexpectedly. Coffee cups slid across tray tables. A businessman's laptop slipped from his lap. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom, each word carefully measured. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be diverting to the nearest suitable airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." In row 15, the woman's eyes snapped open. Not the gradual awakening of someone pulled from sleep, but the instant alertness of a combat veteran who'd learned to distinguish between the sounds of safety and the whispers of impending disaster. She recognized the particular quality of silence that preceded catastrophe, the held breath of an aircraft fighting against physics itself. The plane lurched again, more violently this time. Oxygen masks deployed with their familiar yellow promise of borrowed time. Parents reached for children. Strangers made eye contact, sharing the universal recognition of mortality made suddenly tangible. Rodriguez keyed his microphone once more, his professional composure beginning to crack. "Is there anyone aboard with flight experience? Anyone at all?" The desperation leaked through despite his training, a hairline fracture in the facade of control that every passenger could hear. The woman in row 15 unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements deliberate and purposeful. 20 years of muscle memory guided her forward as fellow passengers pressed themselves against windows, watching the ground grow larger through breaks in the cloud cover below. Major Kestrel Ace, Thorne hadn't touched aircraft controls in 3 years, not since the incident that ended her Air Force career and left her with more questions than answers. But as American Airlines Flight 1847 continued its uncommanded descent toward the Colorado mountains, she found herself walking toward the cockpit, her hand instinctively reaching for the wings insignia that no longer adorned her collar. The flight attendant blocking the cockpit door took one look at Thorne's bearing, the way she moved with absolute certainty through chaos, and stepped aside. "Ma'am, are you?" "Former Air Force," Thorne said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions when seconds mattered more than protocol. "Fighter pilot, 18 years. Captain Rodriguez turned at the sound of her voice, his eyes scanning her civilian clothes with poorly concealed skepticism. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this is a commercial airliner, not a—" The aircraft dropped 300 feet in 2 seconds, throwing everyone against the ceiling before gravity reclaimed them. Emergency lighting bathed the cabin in an amber glow that made everything look like a sepia photograph of disaster. Rodriguez's hands flew across the instrument panel, fighting controls that responded like broken marionette strings. "Sir," Thorne said, settling into the jump seat behind Martinez, "with respect that mountain ridge we just passed, we've got maybe 6 minutes before physics wins this argument." She studied the instrument display with the casual efficiency of someone reading a familiar book. "Primary hydraulics are gone. Secondaries leaking. You're flying on manual reversion, basically power-assisted nothing." Martinez glanced back at her, nodding the way Thorne's eyes moved across the instruments in a precise pattern, cataloging failures and calculating options with mechanical precision. "How do you know about?" "Because 3 years ago, I dead-sticked an F-16 into Nelly's Air Force Base with similar hydraulic failures." Thorne's voice carried no boast, just the flat recitation of facts. "Different aircraft, same physics. The question isn't whether this bird can make it to Denver International. It's whether you want to try threading this particular needle with passengers aboard, or trust someone who's been through this particular hell before." The aircraft yawed right, a sickening slide that pressed everyone against their restraints. Through the cockpit windows, the jagged peaks of the front range emerged from cloud cover like teeth waiting to bite. Rodriguez's knuckles had gone white on the yoke, his training warring against the growing realization that conventional approaches might not save them. "What's your recommendation, Major?" he asked, the title slipping out before he could catch it, recognition of something he'd heard in her voice, the particular cadence of command authority earned through fire rather than bestowed by rank. Thorne leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the terrain display. "There's a municipal airport 12 miles southeast. Single runway, 3,500 feet. Not ideal, but it's flat and clear." She paused, studying the wind indicators. "Question is, can you get us there with what we've got left?" The aircraft was fighting them now, each control input requiring increasing effort as hydraulic fluid continued to hemorrhage into the Colorado sky. Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cabin's chill. Every commercial pilot trained for emergencies, but this was rapidly moving beyond textbook scenarios into the realm where instinct mattered more than procedures. "I can try to get us there," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with concentration, "but I don't know if I can get us down in one piece." Thorne was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting between the instruments and the approaching terrain. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of someone who'd already made a choice that might haunt her forever. "Captain, I know you don't know me from anyone else on this aircraft, but I've put broken birds on the ground before. Let me help." The Boeing 737 continued its descent through thin mountain air, its wounded flight system screaming warnings into the growing darkness. In the cabin behind them, 147 souls waited for someone, anyone, to deliver them safely to Earth. The mathematical reality was simple. They were falling toward mountains at 200 miles per hour, with only fragments of control authority remaining. But mathematics had never accounted for human determination, or the particular stubbornness of those who refused to accept impossible odds. Rodriguez looked at his instruments, then at the terrain rushing up to meet them, then back at the woman whose steady presence had somehow made the cockpit feel less like a tomb and more like a place where solutions might still exist. In the distance, runway lights began to glimmer through the darkness like stars fallen to Earth. "Welcome to the flight deck, Major," he said finally. "Show us how it's done." Outside the cockpit windows, the Colorado landscape spread below them in the gathering dusk, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Somewhere in that maze of peaks and valleys lay a small airport runway, their only chance of survival. Behind them, the passenger cabin had fallen into the peculiar quiet that accompanies the recognition of mortal danger, broken only by whispered prayers and the steady voice of flight attendants moving through their emergency procedures with practiced calm. Thorne slipped into the right seat as Martinez moved to the jump seat, her hands finding the controls with the muscle memory of thousands of hours in military cockpits. The yoke felt different, heavier, less responsive, but the fundamental relationship between pilot and machine remained unchanged. "Talk to me about what we've got," she said, her voice dropping into the clipped efficiency of emergency procedures. Full electrical, good engines, but zero hydraulic authority, Martinez reported. Manual reversion on all flight controls. We've got maybe 10 minutes of fuel before we need to be on the ground, ready or not. The aircraft wallowed through a turn like a wounded whale, each degree of heading change requiring physical effort that left Rodriguez's arms aching. Through the windscreen, the lights of the small municipal airport became visible, two parallel lines of white in an ocean of darkness, impossibly small and impossibly precious. Thorne keyed the radio. Jefferson County Tower, American 1847 Heavy, emergency approach, total hydraulic failure, requesting priority handling. The tower controller's voice crackled back, calm and professional despite the late hour. American 1847, Jefferson County Tower, cleared direct runway 11, winds 120 at 8, altimeter 299er6. Emergency equipment is rolling. Below them, red and blue lights began to converge on the airport like blood cells rushing to heal a wound. Fire trucks, ambulances, paramedics, the entire emergency apparatus of a small Colorado town mobilizing for an aircraft they might not be able to save. The runway looked impossibly narrow from their altitude, a single thread of concrete in a landscape that offered no second chances. "How do you want to work this approach?" Rodriguez asked, his professional skepticism giving way to pragmatic cooperation. The mountain peaks around them were no longer distant threats but immediate concerns, their snow-covered summits gleaming in the moonlight like warnings. Thorne studied the approach plate, calculating angles and distances with the quick precision of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. Standard approach is going to be too steep with no hydraulics. We'll need to come in flat and fast, accept a long float, and hope 3,500 feet is enough runway to get stopped. The passenger cabin had grown eerily quiet, broken only by the soft murmur of flight attendants providing reassurance and the distant sound of someone quietly weeping. Through the small window between cockpit and cabin, Thorne could see faces turned upward, watching the flight crew work with the desperate hope of people whose lives hung in the balance of decisions being made in the space of seconds. "Gear down," Rodriguez called, reaching for the landing gear lever. The aircraft shuddered as the main gear extended, the additional drag causing an immediate sink rate that pressed everyone deeper into their seats. Without hydraulic assistance, the gear had deployed on gravity and airstream alone, functional, but adding unwanted complexity to an already impossible approach. Jefferson County Airport rushed up to meet them, its single runway looking absurdly small compared to the major airports they were accustomed to. Thorne could see the emergency vehicles staged along the taxiway, their lights painting the night in urgent reds and blues. Radio chatter filled the cockpit, tower controllers coordinating emergency response, other aircraft being diverted to different airports, the controlled chaos of an aviation system responding to crisis. American 1847, you are cleared to land runway 11, winds now 110 at 6 knots, the tower called. Thorne keyed the microphone. Cleared to land, American 1847. Be advised this approach may be unconventional. The Boeing 737, designed to carry passengers safely through routine flights, found itself approaching a small mountain airport under circumstances its designers had never imagined. Every system that could fail had failed, leaving only the basic relationship between wings and air, between human judgment and physics. In the cockpit, three people who had been strangers an hour earlier worked with the seamless coordination of a crew that had flown together for years, their individual expertise merging into something greater than the sum of its parts. The runway threshold approached like a finish line at the end of the world's longest race, promising either salvation or catastrophe with equal probability. Behind them, 147 souls held their collective breath, trusting in the skill of strangers to deliver them safely to Earth. The mountain peak stood silent witness, ancient and impassive, as human courage met the immutable laws of gravity and momentum in the thin air of a Colorado night. Time compressed and expanded simultaneously as the aircraft settled into its final approach. The runway lights grew from distant stars to individual beacons, marking the narrow path between disaster and deliverance. In the cockpit, hands moved with practiced precision across controls that no longer responded as intended, while minds calculated scenarios and backup plans for a situation that had no textbook solution. The Boeing 737 crossed the runway threshold at 165 miles per hour, 40 knots faster than normal, but the minimum speed necessary to maintain control authority. Thorne felt the aircraft settle toward the concrete with the particular sensation of a machine at the absolute edge of its capabilities. Not falling, not quite flying, but something in between that required every ounce of skill and luck they could muster. "Spoilers," she called, and Rodriguez pulled the lever that deployed the wing spoilers, metal panels that rose from the aircraft's upper surfaces like scales on some mechanical dragon. Without hydraulic assistance, they deployed partially, creating drag and killing lift, but not with the authority they needed for a normal landing rollout. The main gear touched concrete with a sound like controlled thunder, rubber shrieking against asphalt as the aircraft's weight transferred from wings to wheels. But they were still moving fast, too fast, and the runway ahead looked suddenly, impossibly short. Thorne stood on the rudder pedals, using every technique she'd learned in military training to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the center line. "Reversers," Rodriguez called, pulling the thrust reverser levers that would redirect engine power forward to help slow their ground speed. The aircraft shuddered as the reversers deployed, their metallic howl adding to the symphony of screaming brakes and tortured rubber. Emergency vehicles paralleled their rollout, keeping pace with flashing lights, and the organized chaos of rescue personnel preparing for whatever might come next. The end of the runway approached with mathematical inevitability, marked by red lights that looked like eyes in the darkness beyond the concrete. Thorne could feel the aircraft slowing, but slowly, too slowly, as they ate up precious runway footage with each passing second. The calculation was simple and terrifying. Either they would stop, or they would run out of runway and discover what lay beyond in the darkness of the Colorado wilderness. Come on," Martinez whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of an aircraft fighting to comply with human will. Through the windscreen, the red lights at the runway's end grew larger, closer, more urgent with each heartbeat. The Boeing 737 rolled past the midfield marker, still carrying more speed than any of them wanted to see. But the aircraft was slowing now, the combined effects of brakes, spoilers, and thrust reversers finally beginning to overcome momentum and inertia. The runway end lights that had seemed so threatening began to look more like destinations than threats, promising solid ground and the end of their dance with disaster. 50 knots, 40, 30, 20, 10. The aircraft rolled to a stop with nearly 300 feet of runway remaining, not a comfortable margin by any measure, but enough to transform catastrophe into mere crisis. The sudden silence in the cockpit was profound, broken only by the distant sound of approaching emergency vehicles and the collective exhale of 150 souls who had just discovered they would live to see another dawn. "Jefferson County Tower, American 1847, is safely on the ground," Thorne transmitted, her voice steady despite hands that had begun to shake with the aftereffects of adrenaline. "We'll need emergency, egress assistance and medical evaluation for passengers and crew." The tower controller's response carried unprofessional relief. "American 1847, Jefferson County Tower, welcome to Colorado. Emergency personnel are standing by. Outstanding work, flight crew. Outstanding work." Rodriguez slumped back in his seat, the weight of command finally lifting from shoulders that had carried impossible responsibility for what felt like hours, but had been barely 20 minutes. "Major," he said quietly. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but I've never been happier to have someone prove me wrong about anything in my life." Through the cockpit windows, they could see passengers beginning to move in the cabin, flight attendants guiding them through emergency evacuation procedures with the calm efficiency of professionals who had just participated in a miracle disguised as a routine emergency. Red Cross volunteers were arriving, along with local law enforcement and medical personnel. The entire emergency response apparatus of a small mountain community mobilizing to help strangers who had fallen from the sky. Thorne removed her headset and set it carefully on the instrument panel, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the tremor in her hands. "Captain, it's been an honor flying with you," she said formally, extending her hand with the ritualistic precision of military courtesy. "First Officer Martinez, same to you. You both performed exactly as trained under impossible circumstances." As the three of them prepared to leave the cockpit and join their passengers in the evacuation process, none of them spoke about what they had just accomplished. There would be time later for debriefs and investigations, for analysis of what had gone wrong and what had gone right, for the paperwork and procedures that followed aviation emergencies. But in that moment, in the sudden quiet of a cockpit where disaster had been held at bay by skill and determination, they simply sat with the profound satisfaction of having brought everyone home. Outside, the Colorado night was crystal clear, stars visible in the thin mountain air with a clarity impossible at lower altitudes. Emergency lights continued to paint the scene in urgent colors, but the urgency was transitioning from crisis response to routine, passengers being evaluated, statements being taken, arrangements being made for continuing their interrupted journeys. The Boeing 737 sat quietly on the tarmac, its emergency egress slides deployed like mechanical waterfalls in the floodlight glow. Major Kestrel Thorne gathered her duffel bag from row 15 and joined the stream of passengers moving toward the terminal, accepting quiet thanks and handshakes with the modest demeanor of someone unaccustomed to being recognized for doing what she considered her job. Most of the passengers would never know her name or background, would remember only that someone had stepped forward when expertise was needed and courage was required. But Captain Rodriguez would remember. First Officer Martinez would remember. And in aviation circles, the story would spread, carefully, professionally, with the respect accorded to those who face the sky's challenges and emerge victorious. They would speak of American Airlines Flight 1847 and the passenger in row 15 who had transformed potential tragedy into testament to human capability under pressure. The small terminal building of Jefferson County Airport had been transformed into a temporary refuge, with Red Cross volunteers distributing coffee and blankets, while passengers called loved ones to report their unexpected survival. Local news crews were beginning to arrive, drawn by the combination of aviation emergency and successful outcome that made for compelling television. But Thorne slipped away from the crowds, stepping outside into the cold Colorado night air that carried the scent of pine and snow and the particular clarity that comes with altitude. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama but somehow approving of human courage. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of another aircraft approaching, probably the rescue flight that would carry the passengers to their original destination, continuing journeys that had been interrupted but not ended. The night was quiet except for the distant murmur of voices from the terminal and the occasional radio chatter from emergency vehicles still on scene. Kestrel Thorne stood alone on the tarmac, looking up at the stars that had guided aviators since humans first dreamed of flight, and felt something she had not experienced in 3 years. The profound satisfaction of having used her skills exactly as intended, exactly when needed, exactly where the intersection of training and circumstance had placed her. The scar along her left temple, souvenir of the incident that had ended her military career, seemed less prominent in the starlight, less like a mark of failure and more like evidence of survival. Tomorrow there would be questions, interviews, investigations into what had gone wrong with American Airlines Flight 1847 and what had gone right with its resolution. Federal Aviation Administration investigators would want to speak with everyone involved. The National Transportation Safety Board would launch a formal inquiry. The media would want statements and explanations and human interest angles that could transform technical competence into compelling narrative. But tonight, in the thin air of a Colorado mountain town, Major Kestrel Ace Thorne simply stood beneath stars that had watched over countless aviators before her, feeling the particular peace that comes from having done the right thing at the right moment for the right reasons. The aircraft behind her sat quietly on the tarmac, its emergency complete, its passengers safe, its crew proud of work well done under impossible circumstances. In the distance, runway lights continued to mark the path between Earth and sky, between departure and destination, between the known and unknown that defined every flight since humans first learned to slip the surly bonds of Earth and touch the face of heaven. The lights would burn through the night, guiding other aircraft safely to ground, marking the endless cycle of aviation that connected distant places and distant people through the shared medium of controlled flight. The story of Flight 1847 would become legend in aviation circles, not for its technical failure, but for its human triumph. It would be studied in flight schools and emergency response training programs, analyzed for lessons learned and procedures refined. But beyond the technical aspects lay something more fundamental, proof that when systems failed and procedures broke down, human expertise and courage could still bridge the gap between disaster and deliverance. Major Thorne picked up her duffel bag and began walking toward the terminal, where warm light spilled through windows, and the sound of voices spoke of community formed by shared crisis and mutual aid. Behind her, the Boeing 737 sat quietly in the floodlights, its emergency slides still deployed, evidence of a night when the impossible had been made merely difficult through the application of skill, determination, and the particular kind of grace that emerges when ordinary people are called upon to perform extraordinary acts. The stars continued their ancient dance above the Colorado mountains, witness to another small victory in humanity's ongoing negotiation with the forces of physics and fate. In aviation, such victories were measured not in glory or recognition, but in the simple fact of lives preserved and journeys continued, passengers who would see their families again, crew members who had honored their profession's highest calling, and one former Air Force pilot who had discovered that expertise, once earned, remains available when circumstances demand its application. The night air was cold and thin and sharp with the promise of snow, but inside the terminal, warmth waited, coffee and conversation, the quiet satisfaction of crisis resolved, and the beginning of stories that would be told and retold wherever pilots gathered to speak of the sky's challenges and the humans who met them with skill and courage. Flight 1847 had found its way home, carrying with it not just 150 souls, but proof that even in an age of automated systems and computer-controlled flight, the human element remained irreplaceable when the margins disappeared and expertise became the difference between tragedy and triumph. The terminal doors opened to welcome Major Kestrel Thorne back to Earth, back to the community of the living, back to the ongoing story of human flight that began with dreams of soaring like birds and continued through nights like this one, when the sky tested human resolve and found it adequate to the challenge. Outside, the stars wheeled on in their courses, and the runway lights continued to burn, marking the eternal boundary between earth and heaven that aviators cross daily in the service of connecting the world through the shared miracle of controlled flight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new flights, new tests of human capability against the immutable laws of physics. But tonight, in the warm light of a small Colorado terminal, surrounded by the quiet conversation of survivors and the satisfied efficiency of emergency responders, The only sound that mattered was the gentle murmur of voices speaking of home, journey's end, and the particular kind of gratitude that comes from having been delivered safely through the sky's vast indifference to the care and skill of those who dare to challenge gravity in service of dreams that refuse to remain earthbound. The story of American Airlines Flight 1847 would join the long history of aviation, not as a tale of mechanical failure, but as testimony to human excellence under pressure, to the training and courage and quiet competence that transformed potential disaster into routine emergency, tragedy into triumph, and one more night in the ongoing dialogue between human ambition and the eternal sky that both challenges and embraces those brave enough to call it home. 3 days later, the knock on Thorne's apartment door came at exactly 0800 hours, military precision that told her everything she needed to know about her visitor before she opened it. Through the peephole, she recognized the crisp uniform of an Air Force colonel, his bearing suggesting career headquarters rather than operational experience. Behind him stood a woman in civilian clothes whose posture screamed federal investigator despite her attempt at casual dress. Major Thorne. The colonel's voice carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Colonel Marcus Webb, Pentagon Staff. This is Agent Sarah Chen, National Transportation Safety Board. We'd like to discuss Flight 1847. Thorne opened the door wider, gesturing them into her modest Denver apartment, a place she'd chosen specifically for its view of the mountains and its distance from anything resembling military life. Coffee cups from her morning routine still sat on the kitchen counter, next to a newspaper folded to an article about the miracle landing that had dominated local news for 3 days. "Coffee?" she offered, moving toward the kitchen with the automatic hospitality of someone raised in military tradition. "I assume this isn't a social call." Agent Chen settled onto the edge of the couch, her recorder already in hand with the casual efficiency of someone who conducted interviews for a living. "Major, we're trying to understand exactly what happened during the emergency landing. Your actions were unconventional." The word hung in the air like an accusation disguised as compliment. Thorne poured 3 cups of coffee, noting how Colonel Webb's eyes catalogued her apartment. The absence of military memorabilia, the civilian books on aviation history, the single photograph of her former squadron tucked discreetly on a shelf between commercial flying magazines. "Unconventional how?" Thorne asked, settling into her chair with coffee steaming between her hands. Through the window, morning light painted the front range in shades of gold and shadow, the same mountains that had nearly claimed Flight 1847 just 72 hours earlier. Colonel Webb leaned forward, his expression carrying the weight of questions that went beyond simple technical debriefing. "Major, you've been out of active service for 3 years. Your file indicates you were medically retired following an incident at Nellis Air Force Base. Yet somehow, you managed to guide a commercial airliner through a total hydraulic failure that should have resulted in complete loss of aircraft and passengers." The coffee tasted bitter despite the sugar she'd added, or perhaps that bitterness came from memories that 3 years hadn't managed to sweeten. Thorne set down her cup and met Webb's gaze directly, recognizing the particular look of an officer trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit standard categories. "Sir, with respect, my medical retirement had nothing to do with my ability to fly aircraft," she said quietly. "The incident at Nellis was complicated, but it didn't affect my understanding of flight dynamics or emergency procedures." Agent Chen activated her recorder with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. "Major Thorne, we've reviewed the cockpit voice recordings from Flight 1847. Your performance was textbook perfect, better than textbook. You made decisions that saved 150 lives, but according to your military records, you haven't been in a cockpit since your retirement." The question hidden within the statement was obvious. How does someone maintain such precise skills without practice? Thorne rose and walked to the window, studying the mountains that had looked so threatening from the cockpit of a crippled airliner, but now seemed merely beautiful in the morning light. Agent Chen, flying isn't like riding a bicycle, she said finally. It's more fundamental than that. It's like breathing. Once you really understand it, it becomes part of who you are, not just something you do. Colonel Webb opened a manila folder that had been sitting quietly on his lap, extracting documents that Thorne recognized even from across the room. Her service record, medical evaluations, the formal report of the Nellies incident that had ended her military career, with questions that remained officially unanswered. Major, the Air Force invested 18 years and millions of dollars in your training, Webb said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone delivering a prepared speech. Your performance record was exemplary until the incident. Now, 3 years later, you demonstrate skills that suggest you've been flying regularly despite official retirement. The accusation was subtle but unmistakable. Either she'd been flying without authorization, or something about the Nellies incident had been misrepresented in official reports. Thorne turned from the window, meeting their gazes with the steady composure of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to live with questions that had no easy answers. Colonel, I haven't touched aircraft controls since my retirement, she said simply. What happened aboard Flight 1847 was muscle memory, training, and the particular kind of focus that comes when lives are at stake. Nothing more, nothing less. Agent Chen consulted her notes, her expression suggesting professional skepticism tempered by genuine curiosity. The cockpit recordings indicate you identified the specific hydraulic failure within seconds of entering the cockpit. That level of diagnostic capability suggests recent, extensive experience with similar aircraft systems. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the apartment and highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like microscopic aircraft performing aerobatic maneuvers. Thorne watched them for a moment, remembering the particular way light behaved at altitude, the visual cues that guided pilots through three-dimensional space where conventional navigation failed. Agent Chen, I spent 18 years learning to read aircraft systems under stress, Thorne replied. Fighter aircraft, transport aircraft, civilian aircraft during cross-training programs. When systems fail, they fail in predictable ways. Recognition becomes instinctive after enough experience. Colonel Webb closed the folder and leaned back, his expression shifting from official interrogation to something more personal, the look of one professional pilot studying another across the gap between active service and civilian life. Major, the Pentagon is interested in your current status, he said carefully. Your performance aboard Flight 1847 suggests capabilities that might be useful to ongoing Air Force programs. There might be opportunities for consultation, perhaps even return to active duty under appropriate circumstances. The offer hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial. Thorne had dreamed of such possibilities during the dark months following her retirement, when civilian life felt like exile from everything that had given her life meaning and purpose. But 3 years had taught her that some doors, once closed, remained closed for reasons that transcended simple military necessity. Sir, I appreciate the consideration, she said formally, but my retirement status reflects decisions made for good reasons. Those reasons haven't changed simply because I helped land an aircraft safely. Agent Chen gathered her papers with the efficiency of someone wrapping up an interview that had revealed less than hoped, but more than expected. Major Thorne, the NTSB investigation will continue for several months. We may need to contact you again as our analysis develops. They rose to leave with the particular ceremony of official visits concluding, but Colonel Webb paused at the door, studying Thorne with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that mattered more than professional courtesy required. Major, whatever happened at Nellie's, he said quietly, It doesn't define your entire career. The Air Force remembers excellence, and sometimes circumstances change in ways that create new opportunities. After they left, Thorne stood alone in her apartment, surrounded by the civilian life she'd constructed carefully over 3 years of learning to be someone other than Major Kestrel Thorne, Air Force pilot. The newspaper article about Flight 1847 lay folded on her coffee table, its headline proclaiming, "Heroic passenger saves flight," in letters that made heroism sound simple and straightforward. But heroism, she'd learned, was rarely simple. It emerged from the intersection of training and circumstance, capability and necessity, the willingness to act when action was required regardless of personal cost. 3 years ago, at Nellie's Air Force Base, she'd made decisions that saved lives but ended her career, choices that remained classified and complicated in ways that defied easy explanation. Now, standing in morning light that painted her apartment in shades of gold and possibility, Thorne found herself facing questions she'd thought were settled. Who was she beyond her military identity? And what obligations came with capabilities that couldn't be easily set aside? The sky outside her window stretched endlessly blue, marked by the contrails of aircraft carrying passengers who trusted in the skill of pilots they'd never meet. Somewhere in that vast expanse, other aircraft faced other emergencies, other moments when training and courage would determine whether strangers lived or died. The thought should have been abstract, academic, the concern of people still actively serving rather than retired majors learning to navigate civilian life. But 3 days ago, aboard Flight 1847, she remembered the particular satisfaction of using her skills exactly as intended, exactly when needed. The telephone rang, its sound sharp in the apartment's quiet. Thorne recognized the number on the caller ID, Captain Rodriguez, whom she'd exchanged contact information with during the post-incident debriefing. She answered on the third ring, curious about what could prompt a call from someone she'd known for less than an hour under circumstances neither would forget. "Major Thorne, this is Captain Rodriguez. I hope I'm not calling too early." His voice carried the particular warmth of professional respect earned under pressure, the camaraderie of those who'd shared extreme circumstances and emerged successfully. Thorne settled back into her chair, watching morning traffic begin to build on the street below. "Not at all, Captain. How are you doing? How's Officer Martinez?" "We're both doing well, thanks to you," Rodriguez replied, his gratitude evident even through the phone's electronic filter. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. United Airlines has offered me a position as a training captain, working with pilots on emergency procedures. They want someone with recent experience in unconventional situations." The pause suggested he was choosing his words carefully, walking the line between professional advancement and the implicit acknowledgement that his recent experience included circumstances no training program could fully simulate. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity," Thorne said. "You handled that emergency exactly as trained, under impossible circumstances. Any airline would be fortunate to have your experience in their training program." "Major," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that suggested the real purpose of his call, "they've asked me to recommend someone to help develop the curriculum. Someone with military experience and proven ability to handle emergencies that go beyond textbook scenarios." The invitation was implicit but unmistakable. Return to aviation not as a line pilot but as an instructor, sharing knowledge earned through years of military training and recently demonstrated under crisis conditions. It offered a path back to the sky that avoided the complicated questions surrounding her military retirement, while utilizing skills that 3 days ago had proven their continued relevance. "Captain, I'm honored by the suggestion," Thorne replied carefully, "but my situation is complicated. There are reasons I left active flying that go beyond simple career transition." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, and she could hear the sound of aircraft in the background. He was calling from an airport, probably between flights, stealing time between professional obligations to make an offer that might change both their futures. "Major, I don't know what happened in your past, and I don't need to know," he said finally. "What I know is that 3 days ago, you saved 150 lives, including mine. That kind of competence doesn't disappear because of paperwork or official decisions. If you're interested, I could arrange an informal conversation. No commitments, no pressure." After the call ended, Thorne sat in her apartment surrounded by the carefully constructed quiet of civilian life, feeling the pull of possibilities she'd thought were permanently closed. Outside her window, aircraft continued to trace their paths across the Colorado sky, each one carrying passengers who trusted in systems and procedures and the competence of crews they'd never meet. The offer represented more than simple employment. It was an invitation to rejoin the community of professional aviators, to transform hard-earned knowledge into training that might help others handle emergencies with competence and courage. But accepting would mean confronting questions about her past that she'd spent 3 years learning to live with, reopening discussions about the Nellies incident that had been officially closed but never truly resolved. The newspaper article about Flight 1847 remained folded on her coffee table, its headline a reminder that sometimes circumstances create moments when the past becomes relevant to the present in ways that transcend personal preference. Major Kestrel Thorne had been retired for 3 years, but 3 days ago, she discovered that expertise once earned remained available when needed. The question now was whether that discovery represented a temporary resurrection of old skills under extreme circumstances, or the beginning of a new chapter in a story she'd thought was finished. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in light that promised clarity even as it revealed the complexity of terrain that appeared simple from a distance, but proved challenging when navigated up close. Somewhere in the vast sky above Colorado, other aircraft faced other challenges, other moments when human skill would determine whether journeys ended safely or in disaster. The thought should have been academic for a retired pilot learning to live beyond the cockpit, but 3 days ago had proven that some knowledge carried obligations that transcended official status or personal preference. The telephone sat silent on her coffee table, but Thorne knew it would ring again. Investigators with more questions, reporters seeking human interest angles, perhaps other offers from an aviation community that had taken note of Flight 1847 and drawn conclusions about capabilities that might be useful in contexts beyond emergency landing. Each call would represent another choice between the carefully constructed quiet of retirement and the demanding satisfaction of work that utilized skills earned through years of training and proven under fire. The morning stretched ahead with the particular emptiness of civilian life lived by someone trained for purposes more specific than general existence. Through her window, the sky beckoned with its endless blue promise, marked by the contrails of aircraft whose crews navigated three-dimensional space with the confidence that came from training, experience, and the knowledge that somewhere in the vast aviation community, others stood ready to help when circumstances demanded expertise that went beyond routine procedures. Major Kestrel Thorne rose from her chair and walked to the window, studying the mountains that had looked so threatening from the cockpit of a damaged airliner, but now seemed merely beautiful in the morning light. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay airfields and aircraft, training programs and students who might benefit from knowledge she'd earned through 18 years of military service and demonstrated 3 days ago when expertise became the difference between tragedy and triumph. The decision ahead involved more than simple career choice. It represented the fundamental question of identity for someone caught between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. The Air Force had trained her to be a pilot, but 3 years of civilian life had taught her to be something else, someone whose capabilities remained available but whose official status placed them beyond regular use. 3 days ago, circumstances had temporarily bridged that gap, creating a moment when past training became present necessity in ways that served purposes larger than personal preference. The question now was whether such moments represented exceptions that proved the rule of retirement, or evidence that some stories continued even when their official chapters had ended. The sky outside her window held no answers, only the endless blue promise of possibilities that extended beyond the horizon, in directions that required navigation by instruments more complex than simple desire or professional obligation. Major Kestrel Thorne had spent 18 years learning to fly through such uncertainty, making decisions based on incomplete information and changing circumstances. Now, standing in morning light that painted her apartment in shades of possibility and consequence, she faced another navigation challenge, this time through the complex airspace of a life that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond her control and redirected by events she couldn't have predicted. The flight plan ahead remained unclear, but 3 days ago had proven that sometimes the most important destinations emerged from emergency diversions rather than planned routes. The telephone would ring again, bringing questions and offers and opportunities that required decisions about futures she'd thought were settled. But for now, in the quiet of a Colorado morning, Major Kestrel Thorne simply stood at her window and watched aircraft trace their paths across a sky that continued to call to those brave enough to answer its challenges with skill, courage, and the particular kind of grace that transformed technical competence into something approaching art. Outside, the world continued its daily rotation through space and time, carrying with it the ongoing story of human flight and the individuals who devoted their lives to the mastery of controlled movement through three-dimensional space. The story of Flight 1847 had ended with safe landing and successful evacuation, but the larger story, of expertise applied when needed, of training validated under pressure, of capabilities that transcended official status, continued to unfold in ways that would determine not just one person's future, but the broader question of how society utilized knowledge earned through dedication and proven through service. The morning sun climbed higher, painting shadows that shifted across her apartment floor like runway markers guiding aircraft through the complex approach to destinations that promised either touchdown or the need for another attempt. Major Kestrel Thorne had made such approaches thousands of times, but this one would be different. A navigation through civilian airspace toward purposes that remained undefined but somehow inevitable, guided by instruments more complex than radar or radio navigation, but no less precise in their ability to indicate direction when carefully read and properly understood.